Woo! Thank you. All right. Thanks. All right. Thanks everyone for coming to the third installment of our series Design Now Houston, done in conjunction with the graphic design show that's upstairs. Very excited for who we have today. It's been an epic journey, bringing them in and starting everything, and it's been really, really fabulous. So tonight, 3 speakers, and I'll have to read from a paper because I have so much information, and I kept trying to remember it all, and like their backgrounds are too epic for it. So Javier Fadul is user experience coordinator at Culture Pilot, which is an organization dedicated to, quote, accelerating design and marketing culture, or market culture. His educational background includes studies in cognitive psychology and philosophy. His work is fundamental in connecting thoughtful and creative people through his many endeavors, including TEDx Houston, which is coming up very soon, and Visualize.com, which is an international conference on the human stories behind data visualization, which is super, super awesome. Following him will be Ned Doddington, who is the design director of the visual communications team at PDR in Houston. He's the founder and director of Caroline Collective, which is Houston's first and largest co-working space, the founding director of animalarchitecture.org, and also a founding board member of C2 Creative, and he's been published in numerous places, and recently an award winner?
Yes.
Yes. What was that award for?
Emerging Leader from the Design Future Council.
There you go. That's huge. Congrats on that. That's amazing. Yeah. Susan Rogers is the director of Community Design Resource Center, CDRC, at the University of Houston's College of Architecture, and an assistant professor. Her work focuses on design as a strategy for community change and explores the seams between design, justice, and the public interest. She's a co-author of In Architecture of Change, which is the intro to expanding architecture. Her work has been published also in numerous places, including Site. So actually, if you could join me first in welcoming Javier to the stage.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks so much for my fellow panelists today. It's going to be a really fun session. It's been an epic journey, talking about all the things that we could talk about, and I think the shape and the form that we've arrived at is going to be really fun. So my role in this presentation is going to be discussing this concept of envisioning Houston from the context of the quantified self, sort of personal data movement. So I'm curious, how many of you have heard this quantified self term in the past before? There's a few, a lot of my friends, which is really cool. So this quantified self idea is about how people can be empowered with all the data that we're all generating every day to make better decisions about our lives. And so I hope to shed some light into what's possible these days. And then, yeah, I think it's going to be a really awesome journey with the next narratives that are going to be coming after as well. So sample size of 2 in 3 movements. We will begin. So here is a bar graph right off the bat, and you can tell a lot of things based on just the shape of this form, right? There's these like bars that have these lengths, and the length could provide some meaning. The groupings of them, the fact that they're kind of in pairs, could provide some meaning, and there's definitely a lot of color, right? The color itself has a certain value, different contrasts, and this type of graph could be used to visualize a lot of different types of information. For example, you can imagine this graph being used for telling a story about a story. So each one of these bars could be a chapter, and the color could represent the mood of the theme, or perhaps different characters telling, or that are focused on in the narrative, right? But this bar actually represents something very different. It's actually a very personal data set of mine. It's actually the most personal data set that I could think of to present today. And I also happen to have this data set, which is very different from the previous, but you can see that it has a very similar form. The color's very different. There's still some contrast, but primarily it's blue with a little snippet of red right in the middle. And here's both data sets presented side by side. you can see the contrast a whole lot more, and you can derive a few more insights into thinking what these bars might represent. And this blue graph actually represents my wife, who's like right there in the middle. We've been married for a little over a year, and you know, she's very close to me, which is why I also have access to this very personal data. And does anybody have any ideas what the data actually might be? Yeah?
Is that a hanging chat on the right?
Oh, you mean this right here?
Oh, right.
Yeah. Well, the bars themselves and the colors are actually a representation of me and my wife's DNA code. So this is actually a visualization of what makes us us in a sort of very deep sense, you know. And now with that context in mind, you can see a lot more insights into sort of who we are as people, right? And I haven't even explained anything about like the colors and what they actually mean, but now that you have this sort of frame of reference into what this data means, it becomes much more interesting in a way. And it's a relatively new type of data. Just in 2003 was the first time that a whole human genome was sequenced, and it cost $300 million of research money in order to actually achieve this thing, right? And then just 3 years ago, me and my wife decided to spend $100 to get our DNA sequenced, and we spit in a tube and sent it off to scientists who gave us back these really great data visualizations that allow us to understand ourselves a little bit better. And the complexity of the data, I think, is something that's really fascinating. Each one of these data sets is actually 1.5 gigs of information, but it's, you know, the base pairs of the TA-GC mapping, which is actually a representation of these molecules that are uniting and, you know, uncoded and decoded in order to manifest how these cells behave and make up who I am and ultimately what I do as a whole human. So yeah, so it's a really interesting type of data that I wanted to explore with you guys. But what does it actually mean? What do the colors actually mean? So here's the labels, which is very important in any type of information design. And as you can tell, I'm 77% European. That light blue that's sort of sporadically throughout shows that I'm actually primarily Southern European with a bit of Northern European mixed in. I'm also 15.2% East Asian / Native American, primarily Native American, which is really cool to find out. And 4.8 Sub-Saharan African, which I'm very proud of, because I had no clue that this was part of my heritage. And I think that's a really good example of the fact that in information visualization, when you can find out something that you didn't know, it becomes like much more interesting than finding out things that you did know. And when you kind of check your assumptions and correct yourself because of it, I think that's really compelling. And I wanted to mention also that 1.1% Middle Eastern. My last name is Fadul, and it's part of my identity and my narrative. The fact that I was from Colombia, but my great-great-grandfather is from Lebanon, was a big part of my identity. But this kind of showed me that I'm actually more Sub-Saharan African in my DNA than Middle Eastern, which was really fascinating. In contrast, here's my wife's DNA, and she is 99.7% European and 100% awesome. Primarily, she's Northern European, which means that she has much of those richer blues, and a very sort of homogeneous mixture, but overall European. And also, in terms of the insights that we didn't know before, is that she's 3% Ashkenazi, which is a particular Jewish sect that we had no idea about either. So it's something that we're going to look into more as far as her heritage, because we find it to be really interesting that we derive that insight. So here's similar data, but in a new representation showing the geographical context and percentages. And this just goes to show that, you know, this is a context that is important, is that this heritage comes from the 500-year period. So basically, at the time where humans hadn't yet crossed the oceans, this is where our DNA came from in these cases, right? So because Ashley was primarily in Northern Europe, her heritage is primarily focused in that region. In contrast, my DNA was sort of primarily in the Southern Europe region. And, you know, the Spaniards, the conquistadors and all that, they traveled a lot, and they met a lot of people, and they mated with a lot of people from all over the world. And that kind of explains a little bit why perhaps my DNA is a little bit more jumbled up than hers is. So these like lifetimes, generations, all of these decisions that people made somehow added up to us meeting and knowing each other. And if you have ever spent time with me and my wife, I think seeing this graph really kind of represents the fact that I'm a little bit confetti and she's a little bit more blue sky. So I find it to be really beautiful, and it's very meaningful to me to see this image. Also looking into the future of how our DNA could eventually create new humans, and seeing how their image might relate to us as well. So this is a story about data overall. Data is numbers, and numbers by themselves are pretty boring, so I decided to Instagram it and give it a little bit of data by itself, you can do a lot with it, you can manipulate it, but ultimately you get more numbers, and that, it's more data to deal with, right? But whenever the data has context, whether it's geographical, biological, or narrative context, the data becomes really meaningful. But when that context is about who you are as an individual, then that becomes really compelling, right? And the value of data is something that I think is becoming more and more prevalent in sort of conventional culture in a way. But it's also a story about form, and form by itself can be very beautiful, and these shapes have a certain logic to them, and they're visually appealing. But form by itself, or when form has meaning, it can become really, really compelling. These shapes are actually representing geographical locations. So now that you know that, there's a little bit more of an understanding of the logic behind them. So this one actually represents the past 29 years of my life. So even though in this context it's just a line and shape, and for most of you it's relatively meaningless, for me each one of these points represents a whole lot of history and an experience. So if I label the data with a map, then you can see a little bit more of all the places that I've been in my life. And Edward Tufte says that maps are like the ultimate visualization of data because they're pure data. Like the labels are data, the background is data, the foreground is data, the whole thing is data. So in terms of data visualization, if you want to get into information graphic design, dive into maps because that's a great way to get started. So this is a very meaningful polygon for me, 29 years, 12 years in South America, 17 up in the States. And this polygon is my wife's polygon, representing her lifetime of travel. And for her, it's very meaningful. For me, the far right is especially meaningful because it represents the time when we first started our relationship, where we were just communicating through the magic of the internet and phone calls because she was spending some time in Spain. So this little corner is really meaningful to me. And then finally, this polygon actually represents all the places that we've been to together. So encoded in this shape is every experience, or every really remarkable experience that we've ever had together, including the narrative of how I asked her to marry me, the time that we spent for our honeymoon in Playa del Carmen, and the time that we spent in New York City helping organize Visualize with the Culture Pilot team. And Visualize was a conference that was all about the really compelling stories that are being enabled by this new form of visual communication. And it was a blast to see the impact that this type of medium is having on communities all across the world. Including this company called Meshu, who has created this really cool system, which I use to generate these graphics, where you just type in all of the places that you've been, and then you can actually order the shape as a 3D printed or laser cut device. So, so it gives you a little token of all of your memories that you can wear around as a necklace or something like this. So it's a pretty interesting new medium that people are exploring out there. So I wanted to take a moment to discuss this issue of privacy because the climate currently is very interesting, right? Like the whole Snowden issue that's being discussed, and just this morning it was announced that the NSA and CIA have spent $56.2 billion worth of money in sort of secret by investing all that money in understanding better ways to aggregate data, to visualize data, and ultimately to better protect us, right? But I feel like we shouldn't be as scared as the national media has made it seem. Like it's really not that bad because data is really valuable. I think that's the key lesson that we should all take. I mean, for sure, there's a lot of privacy issues and civil rights issues that need to be ironed out and sort of solved. But data is a really useful tool for the government to help serve us better, for the service providers that, all the social networks that we use, right? They're using all of that data in order to connect us, to help us work better. Even the manufacturers and the providers of the communication services that we have are using all of this information in order to make better decisions about how to serve us, right? But ultimately, it's our data. Like, it's your data. You're generating a bunch of this data. And I think it's really important for us to realize how important it is for us to empower ourselves with that information and make better decisions about our own lives and each other and the way we live in our context. And speaking of context, here is some of the data that I pulled from Google's data liberation front. There's a team within Google that allows you to take out your data as easily as it was to put it into their systems. So this graph represents 600,000 data points over the past 3 years of any time that I used my cell phone to navigate or to find out where I was in Houston. The actual data set includes all of the other cities as well, but I wanted to zoom into Houston itself since Envisioning Houston is sort of the theme. So just looking at this, can you kind of anchor yourself? Can you see like the part of town that I hang out in? Could you make an inference maybe of where I live, perhaps, and where I work, based on just the density, right? So all of this information encoded, like a whole lot of data, right? Encoded in a simple graphic where in just a few seconds, you can make a lot of assumptions about my patterns and all the places that I still haven't seen, right? So if you guys have any recommendations of the southeastern portion of this, I'm setting this goal that in the next year, that whole part is going to be at least a lot brighter, at least a lot brighter. Another interesting point is how taking the data into this other context allows you to see it in a very new way and to manipulate it in new ways. So this is the graph of my wife's information. So now, can you assume or kind of guess what part of town? Can anybody like just shout out the neighborhood maybe of where you live?
Bel Air.
Bel Air area? Yeah, close. That's yeah, pretty close, definitely. And her workspace, like where does she work? There, second place. Anybody?
Galleria.
Right on. Yeah. Okay. Well, they're kind of backwards actually. And now that we have both data sets, we can superimpose them and just do a difference filter in Photoshop, which is very easy. And you can see all the places that we've been to together, right? So all the yellow areas represent our traffic together. So now it's much easier to tell that we actually live together in the Galleria, and she works in the medical center, and I work in the Heights of Houston at Culture Pilot. And this comparison would have been so difficult if we were just dealing with numbers, right? Like, matching up these two data sets would have been just a very complex thing to do. But by bringing it into the pixel space and smashing them together, you can derive a lot more insights into our behavior. And we can derive a lot of insights into how we want to live in our city as well. So that's actually my last slide. And thank you all so much for being here. My good friend Ned is going to join us, Ned Doddington. Please welcome him on stage.
Hello. Thanks, Daniel, for inviting me to be part of this. Do I just hit the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I don't know, Daniel didn't quite mention this at the beginning, that we're sort of taking you through 3 different scales of design and application of design thinking and graphic design techniques at 3 different scales. So Javier started us off at the deeply personal and individual scale. I'm going to try to find a place in the sort of the architectural and built world, and then Susan's going to take us to the larger scope. But Javier's already kind of showed us some maps of big scale stuff. But anyway, so hopefully there's a nice little turnaround there. So as Daniel mentioned, I've got a few projects kind of cooking at the same time. So what I thought I'd do for this talk is talk about my work in the corporate world at PDR, and then my work sort of independently at Animal Architecture. And I'm going to try to weave a sort of thread between the two. So my talk is going to be designing for the shared environment, particularly at the architectural scale. So a major question that I'm interested in is how do we behave in groups and with each other and with those around us? And then the corollary question is how does that relationship kind of impact our built environment? And I guess on the flip side, how does our environment, our built environment, impact those relationships? And so what I'm going to try to do here, and there's going to be a lot of information, and you'll forgive me if I go a little fast through these things. There's a question and answer session at the end. And I don't expect you guys to sort of really get all the information off of every slide. So there are no notes, it's not a quiz. But I'm going to try to weave a story between designing for two different user groups, humans and animals. So you'll just have to sort of bear with me as I try to pull that thread together. So both of these projects, I'm going to contend, employ kind of design thinking and graphic design techniques to tune environments to specific user groups. And in these two cases, a user group that could be at your general sort of Houston company, or a cow, goat, or a flock of birds. So before we get into that, let me just introduce these two projects a little bit more fully. So this is the website, the front page of the PDR website. So PDR is a workspace design company. We've been in Houston for 30 years. I run the visual communications team at PDR, but the office in general does workspace design. So we're experts in figuring out how you work and tuning your environment to your work practices. And these are some of the kind of PR marketing statements from PDR. Animal architecture, so this is the front page from my website, Animal Architecture. And animal architecture is an ongoing investigation into the performative role of design in ecology. So this is about kind of helping designers and architects and design thinkers think about actually collaborating, designing with non-human agents, and sort of inviting animals into the design table. So what I'm going to try to figure out here is how can I possibly bridge the gap between these two worlds? So here's an example of what we do at the visual communications team at PDR. It's corporate graphics. It's like super huge environmental graphics displays. Some of them are backlit. We involve a lot of rich media displays, interactive displays. It could be as simple as paint on a wall. Before I go any further, I should really sort of thank everyone on my team. I mean, I'm showing a lot of other people's work. This is not just me. I have a team of 13 people, and it's an office. So all these folks, I don't think any of them made it tonight, because they have to hear me talk about this every day. Anyway, there's a lot of help behind these projects. So just quickly going through some of the corporate work again. We do wayfinding, environmental graphics, branding, sort of print materials, collateral, graphic design standards. All of this stuff you can keep in mind. This is sort of a small firm inside of a larger firm. So we do print standards and graphics for the corporation. Infographics, more along the lines of what Javier just talked about. We're also getting into sort of interactive displays on sort of portable devices for corporate use. And then we set up these kind of, occasionally we get invited to do these kind of large interactive sort of situations with lots of cool content and fun models and rooms filled with beautiful displays. And so that's just kind of fun. All right, so those were the two basic projects, Animal Architecture and PDR. Excuse me a second. So again, we're going to try to talk about how do we use design thinking and design practices like representing data and information to sort of tune environments based on behavior. And so on the one hand, we have human behavior sort of panel on the left, and on the right, this is a diagram of actually sort of cow patterns for a proposed project. So I'm going to say that there are basically 6 different kind of steps that are used for both design exercises. It's getting to know your client, it's developing a kind of user profile, it's illustrating connections between those profiles, running through schematic design, testing those schematic designs through scenarios, and then emphasizing a kind of an identity based on who the client is. So for the client interview, so now I'm going to go back and forth, like PDR, animal architecture, PDR, animal architecture. So the first slide, so this is a basic, this is where we start the client with a visioning session. Probably a lot of you in the office use similar techniques for your work, where you throw up a lot of sort of images on a wall and ask the client to put stickers on the ones they like, the ones they don't like. Other firms call these mood boards. Anyway, so this is the kind of first meeting with the client. With animal architecture, it's a little bit difficult. You can't really ask your user group what do they want. So you have to observe them. There's more kind of an observational technique with the animal projects. And trust me, this is actually serious work. I mean, this is not like, I'm not the only person kind of going on about animal architecture. There's a whole sort of other sort of movement, actually, of people working with animals in this way. You'll trust me on that for now. So then, much like, say, with Javier's information, we would take sort of, after you've taken the survey and participated in our visioning session, we would have a basic kind of profile of how you work, who you are you mobile, are you sedentary, do you like quiet spaces, do you like loud spaces, do you commute all the time, so we set up these kind of user profiles. And on the similar side, we can set up kind of user profiles based on animal patterns. So cows, birds, goats, as we can see here, they live in certain ways, they eat certain things, they behave in certain patterns. So there are 3 projects here that I'll sort of walk you through that sort of show how you can actually develop a user profile for a particular species. Once you get that profile, we start laying out bubbling diagrams, really rough sort of design relationship diagrams showing how spaces might work together. On a similar side, you can start to apply spatial characteristics with these certain user patterns. So cows, there's been a little bit of talk about this. Cows actually like to walk in a sort of curvilinear pattern. They don't really like to walk in a straight line. A designer like Temple Grandin has pointed this out in a couple other publications. So cow paths tend to be curvilinear. So there's an embedded kind of design logic to the way a cow moves. And there are different patterns for different species. So you can start to illustrate a little bit of the path here. And this is where design thinking kind of comes into play. It's about finding those sort of invisible things that you need to represent and make visible. So once you get to that point, you can sort of, now you're just applying more and more spatial constraints, reorganizing that program, making more sense of it, as still sticking with your sort of bubble diagram decisions. Again, now on the animal architecture side, moving through spatializing some of those design characteristics. So on the left here, it's really small, but we've been able to quantify the amount of alfalfa that a goat can eat on a given day. So that means that so you can start to sort of anticipate that maybe a goat could, graze just that strip in one day. And you can start sort of arranging other sort of infrastructure around those patterns. So again, sort of similar kind of design thinking logic. There we go. On the corporate side, we start to test that. We test it through scenario planning, where here you see 2 different competing sort of versions of the same plan that show very different user profiles. For example, formal collaboration is up on one side and down on another. One plan has a town center versus the other one that doesn't. So this is trying to tune the environment to a specific design user group. So this might be a great space for an ad agency, but maybe not a great space for attorneys or something. I've sort of scrubbed all the client information from these things, so I can't actually remember what space it is. But anyway, you get the idea. So same thing with on the animal side, we can start to sort of run through design scenarios about migratory patterns, grazing patterns. Here's the diagram of the cow walking on the curved path, and these are some diagrams from Temple Grandin's publication. Temple Grandin is a great thinker and researcher about animal ethology and behavior. You should look up her name when you get a chance. And I quote her a lot in animal architecture work. And then the last step is to kind of make this yours. And the last step of the design project would be to add a sort of identity to the project. So super graphics. This is a really typical slide from something I do at PDR, which is applying kind of a large branded picture to a corporate space. On the other side, the animal architecture projects propose to organize buildings and color schemes and sort of patterns that are associated with the animals. And so that design and shape and sort of texture is associated with the animal specifically. So I'll walk you through one more, this project. So I was lucky enough in 2010 to be awarded an RDA grant to pursue a project with a friend of mine, Melissa McDonald. And we came across a really interesting study from the Houston Audubon Society that claimed that there are no birds in downtown Houston. Like literally, it said that there's 0 birds in downtown Houston And I was living in downtown Houston at the time, pushing pigeons off my balcony, and I thought, this is ridiculous. And maybe it's an issue about observation and not so much about the birds being there or not. So we set about trying to design or proposing new sort of birding habitats and ways to observe birding in downtown Houston. I'm just going to go quickly through this project. Through our own observations, we did determine that there were actually birds in downtown Houston. And we set up a little design matrix here, quantifying the places where they live, the things that they eat, how they forage, where do they roost, and setting up a matrix so you can kind of see here where the lines aggregate. That the darker the line, the more popular it is. So that pigeons and sparrows, most of the birds tend to live along human structures, and that they eat insects and then also forage on the ground. So it's like, okay, good, we got something to work with. So we also did some observational research into how they roost and how they position themselves vis-a-vis the built environment. So whether they're sort of roosting inside of an overhang or a nook kind of thing like that, or if they're on a branch sort of perched outside of the structure. So they're two different. So that's your house versus your tree kind of icons. So we went forward and then did some more design iterations of this, trying to sort of map real basic design shapes to sort of nesting and roosting patterns, and map that to heat maps of proximity to water sources, food sources, and sort of detrimental things like parking garages or too much traffic, so that you end up with sort of proposal sites for, like, maybe along the bayou, it'd be a good place to install these kind of bird perches to attract this kind of bird. And so this is not, again, it's not all that nuts, and it makes a little bit more sense with looking at the sort of design space for the accountant versus the ad agency. That if you sort of understand behavior and you can map it accordingly, you can then tune it for scenarios and end up with a design proposal, whether you're an accountant or an egret. So we had a lot of fun with this. And these are some of the other design proposals. So this is the parking lot. I was living at the Houston house. I don't know if anyone recognizes that. So all these photos are from Houston. I took them, on Saturday. So basically, we're getting close to the end here. But the point of the talk was that design thinking and design logic. I don't have a graphic design background, oddly enough. I have an architecture background, but I use these kind of graphic design techniques and illustrative techniques to arrive at architectural solutions for the most part. And so this can happen, and I'm particularly interested in behavior-based design, and it can be applied across species. And just as sort of a side note, I think that a lot of this has kind of an urban or cosmopolitan attitude towards it. It's about sort of living and working with others, right? It's about sort of cohabiting and coexisting in the same place, whether it's a coworker or if the other species around you. And I just want to bring us back to these two slides that sort of no matter who you are or what you do or what animal you happen to be, that there are ways to sort of engage design thinking to solve a problem. And so it's not really a design discussion about the human or the animal, but it's a design solution for the human-animal. So thanks so much. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Susan is up next.
Oh, that's fine. First, I want to thank Daniel for having me and for my co-presenters here. I'm going to talk about how data can make better cities. So where Javier talked about how data might make us better individuals, I'm going to talk about how data might help us understand cities and to actually make them better. It is my thinking that the city both makes us and we make the city. It's simultaneous. How we imagine it, how we represent it, how we understand it, how much of it we actually know through experience and how much we know through anecdote or other people's kinds of understanding of the city. So the first thing I want to do is kind of turn everything upside down, is that the way that we represent and we think about the city impacts how the world is imagined. This is the standard Mercator map, developed and drawn first in 1569, turned upside down. The privileging of the North over the South, in the typical kind of way we present a map, has changed the relationship between those places. And the decision to put North up, and whether there is a North or a South, is a decision all in itself that can change futures. So I wanted to show the Dymaxion map that was developed by Buckminster Fuller in 1943. It has no up and down. It has no north or south. So there's no hemisphere that dominates over another hemisphere. And so the goal was actually to create a map that didn't distort proportions, giving some countries kind of a bigger land area than they actually have, nor to kind of provide a map that, because you can unfold this or fold it back anyway, so there's really no center or edge or anything else. And so that's, I think for me, this is a really beautiful example about how information changes how we think about the world. So I want to talk a little bit about information and what it can tell us. This is simply 2 lines, the blue line representing population density, the pink line representing land area, and you can see that Houston's at the very end of all of those worldly cities, meaning we have the highest amount of land area and the lowest population density. So the pink line goes down towards Mumbai, lowest land area, highest population density. How we think about ourselves in relationship to the world, I think also can change how we think about our city. So when we say sprawl, here's evidence of what that might mean, but it gives us even I think a more succinct picture because it tells us what it means in relationship to the world. Not in relationship to Dallas, or Austin. So how we live though in our city and in our world, I think very much influences kind of how we think about what is good and what is bad and what parts of the city we don't go to. So Houston is divided. There's two mechanisms by which Houston is divided. The first one is east from west. The industrial city from the post-industrial city, the information economy city versus the city of the working man and woman. But Houston is also divided between the inside and outside the loop. That kind of distinction that holds all things hip inside, all things suburban, and outside, right? And so I want to talk about those 2 divisions and what those divisions mean and how those divisions shape our experience of the city in some way. The one thing I could say, the east to west division is stark. It's stark in terms of demographics, meaning on the east side of Houston, almost without fail, with some exceptions, including Kingwood and Clear Lake, all of the median household income is below the average median household income in the city of Houston. On the west side of that dividing line, almost all of the neighborhoods have higher incomes than they do than the average is in the city of Houston, with some exceptions, A-Leaf, Gulfton, the kind of corridor along Bel Air. The same is true in terms of educational attainment. And basically, educational attainment is synonymous or parallel with income in our city. And obviously, they're very, very related. So in some ways, this could be considered the DNA of cities, like Javier and his wife's DNA. This kind of tells us something about what cities are like. If you start looking at health, health is directly related to both of those things. So things like heart disease and obesity, asthma, so on and so forth, are basically follow the same map. So the division is not just anecdotal, the division is real. And it changes. Like, because Javier, that's the part of town he doesn't go to, right? I mean, I'm just saying. the terms of shopping malls, if you map the shopping malls, almost all of them are in the West. This is a map of grocery stores in Houston. Houston has fewer grocery stores per capita of any major city in the United States, according to the Food Trust Organization. And the goal of this map was to try to identify neighborhoods that didn't have access to health and fresh food. But what becomes shocking is that when you look at two neighborhoods that are probably no more than 2 miles from another, the person on the left, we like to call her Jane. She lives at Fairview and Yukon Street in Montrose. I'm sorry, the Fiesta's still on here, it's gone, but now you have Trader Joe's, so I'm just gonna pretend like it's the same amount. You know, within a mile of her house, she can walk. Within a mile are 6 grocery stores in almost any direction. And there's 3 more just on the edge of that mile. So there's really like 10. I got 10 grocery stores I can pick from. Where do I want to go? Somebody, John, who lives in the 3rd ward at the intersection of Alabama and Tier-Wester, there's not a single grocery store in his mile. Not one. Not at all. And so I think that, you know, and here they are, right next to each other, right? Literally, but one's on the east side, I'm going to say, one's on that side. I just pointed out the other's on the west side. So, water, well, it doesn't divide us, it certainly doesn't hold us together. And I feel like in Houston, I went through a great presentation last night at the MFA about kind of all of the things that kind of hold us together. Water is certainly one of them. In Houston, we have roughly 2,500 miles of waterways, ditches, drainage channels, so on and so forth. About half of those are man-made, half are natural. So not only do we have a network of natural system, we have a network of man-made systems. And so one of the things that I have been interested in is how do you use maps, not just as a way to represent data, but as an interactive kind of medium to get people involved in understanding the implications of the larger environmental challenges that face our city. In other words, so that we can understand that the flood zone is more than an issue of what's happening on our individual lot, it's an issue of what's happening across our city. So this was a 1,500 square foot map that we had in the atrium of the College of Architecture, where we asked people to put a pin where they lived. And it was amazing. I don't know how many I think Jasmine, did you see it? It was awesome. Anyway, it tried to get us to think about what connects us more than what divides us. So I want to talk a little bit about the division between inside and outside the loop. The one thing I have to point out is that of the 10 super neighborhoods in Houston with the highest population density, 6 are outside the loop. In fact, 4 of the top 5 densest neighborhoods in the city of Houston are outside the loop. So it's not just 6 of the 10, it's actually 4 of the highest ones. So population density can be, and population density matters for those of us who think about city design because it makes public transportation work. It makes the availability of kind of grocery stores and walkability and things like that, it makes that work. And so when you have density, that can work. When you don't have it, it doesn't. Meaning that we have places outside the city that could work really, really well because of the population density and if they had good transportation connections and so on and so forth. The inside, the outside loop is also bumpy. This is, I did this in there's 2 numbers. There's median household income in 2000, which is the blue line, and median household income in 2009, which is the pink line. These are all the census tracts that hit Bel Air Boulevard from Main Street, well, Holcomb at Main, basically in the middle of the Texas Medical Center, out to Highway 6. So what does it tell you?
6'7".
Huh?
After 6'7", that's a big jump.
What is that? What's the jump? Which way is it going?
Up.
It's going up big time. Yeah, so this is median household income across that track. So the thing that you can see is that what happens when you hit 610, the amount of wealth goes up exponentially. And it's continued to go up over the last 10 years. And I suspect that the 2020 will do the same exact thing. The next is the same corridor, the same census tracts, but this time I'm mapping the percent of the population born outside the United States. You can see it's exactly the opposite. So, and when you hit 610, the percent of the population that is born outside the United States exponentially increases and hits roughly somewhere between 25 to 60%, depending on what neighborhood you're in. I know that the Bel Air corridor is not every corridor in Houston, and in fact, I've tried to replicate that kind of stark data, and there's not another street that does that. But I think that it does say something about our city. So I had to point this out because the Houston Apartment Insiders recently did a post about what it's like to live inside the loop. And in fact, the east side of the loop even got left off. And so, I don't know, maybe this doesn't shock anybody but me. But I'm like, really? Yeah, so this is their map. Inside the loop means 59 west. Yeah, and none of this, no Eastwood, no, Anyway, so when we start making those definitions, though, there's also assumptions that go with that, right? About how cool is it to live inside the loop? And now there's all these new people in our city who think they live like that's the loop. And, and so they're going to get confused when somebody says, oh yeah, go to Bohemia's, it's inside the loop, and they're going, wait, sorry. So sometimes maps can also define features. I apologize that I don't have the map for Houston, but this is, I don't know how many of you have heard the word redlining. This is the redlining map for Austin. These were generated in the 1940s. And what they did is they basically told futures. They basically decided what part of Austin would succeed and what would fail. And so sometimes when we draw things, we make predictions, and sometimes those predictions become realities. Raphael knows that very well. So, Houston is extremely vacant. According to a fairly recent study by the city of Houston, about 25% of all of our land, all of our 627 miles of sprawl is vacant. You could put the city of Boston in our vacant land 3 times. So we could take the entire city of Boston and put it in our vacant land. That's how much we have, and some 120-something square miles of vacant property. So Houston is also, there's neighborhoods, I guess, that are in that, outside of that new inside the loop definition, like the 3rd Ward, that are disappearing. In some ways because of that map that I showed you for Austin. I'm sorry, I don't have the Houston one. In other ways because of the investment with the light rail and the risk of gentrification. So I just wanted to end really quickly about where we live can tell us about who we are. In fact, most people would suggest that your zip code is probably the highest. It would tell us the most about your habits, like what do you buy, and where do you shop, and how much money do you make, and what's your educational level. The DNA, if you will, of cities. So there's actually a corporation that does this, Claritas. They have these market segmentation that gives us demographic analysis. And so I pulled it for 77006, which is where you are right now. That's the zip code, in case you didn't know. But maybe you probably all did because you're all young and you use your GPSs. But so these are the basic demographics that Claritas provided me for this zip code. And then there's a group of, cultural groups or market segments that inhabit this zip code. I want to talk about 2 of them. And so first is Bohemian Mix. And so everybody can stand up if this fits them. They shop at the Gap, they watch foreign movies, they read GQ, they watch Boxy or Telemundo, and they drive an Audi S4. Please stand. Okay, well maybe what we have here, given the 10X connection, is the young Digerati. So you shop at Bloomingdale's, you read well, you travel to Asia, you watch independent films, and you drive an Audi A3. Awesome! Thanks. I knew I'd get somebody. Yeah, so, and then there's a few other kind of demographic trends about these people. Try it out. Go to Claritas Corporation, put in your zip code, and see what it says about you. Sometimes, though, it can be a little bit more dire. In California, if you live in California, you can put in your zip code for anywhere in California, and it will give you your life expectancy. That's not a nice thing. And this is actually not a joke, nor is it like, oh, this is funny. This is from the California Department of Health, to try to get people aware about the implications of where you live and how it impacts your health. So with that, I just wanted to finish by talking a little bit about real places and the fact that exploring the city without one of these is worthwhile. And trying to understand places that you don't normally go, or to take field trips. We like to do that. We call it in my office. It's like, let's go on a field trip. And it's just a place we want to go. It's not actually anywhere really exciting, and you probably wouldn't use it as a field trip, but I think getting out and seeing the city is really important. And I think the more we know about the city, the more we can actually work together to make it a better place. So, thank you.